Just first of all to say a very warm welcome, no, maybe I shouldn't say a very warm welcome, a cooling welcome to all of you, and thank you for making the effort to be here today. I know that for some people that will have been quite an effort, battling with the transport system and our general lack of climate resilience in London. But it's good to see that so many have made the effort. I'll introduce our guest speaker in a moment, but a small housekeeping point, if I may, before we begin with the proceedings of today. Our next lunchtime event will take place in this room on Tuesday the 7th of July, so really not very long at all. It'll be a panel discussion entitled "The Future of NATO, Adopting to a New Security Landscape." July the 7th, of course, is the first day of the NATO summit. Lord Robertson, my co-chair and former NATO Secretary General, will be chairing that meeting, and no, he won't. He will be on the panel, so beg your pardon. He will be on the panel. Of course, he was also the lead reviewer in the 2025 Strategic Defence Review. It will actually be chaired by Professor Michael Clarke, and everybody is very welcome. If people want to come, please do go on the website or talk to Jacqueline, who's at the back there, and she can give you any further details that you need. Our session this afternoon is we're going to hear from our guest speaker, Jenny Bates. We're very lucky to have. Jenny is the 4th Heywood Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government. Her career spanned more than 2 decades of economic policy making in the British government across 3 departments, FCDO, BEIS and HM Treasury, working at the intersection of international and domestic economic issues. She's a professional economist and has led interdisciplinary analytical teams. Not quite sure what they are, but they sound very impressive. As well as leading policy work on topics including trade and economic security, industrial strategy, climate and the energy transition, and development finance. She was Director General in the FCDO from 2020 to 2025, undertaking 2 roles, one focused on China and the Indo-Pacific, and then more recently on, it says here, economics, climate and global issues. I find it deeply reassuring that the FCO is focused on global issues. Prior to joining the FCDO, Jenny led the Smith Commission Secretariat on the devolution of further power to Scotland. She spent significant periods of time in Washington, both through a posting to the British Embassy from 2005 to 2009, and before that, before joining the government, working on trade policy at the Progressive Policy Institute from 1998 to 2001. The title of our talk today is "The UK and the EU in the New Global Economic Order." So Jenny, over to you. We look very much forward to hearing what you have to say, and I've no doubt people will be formulating apposite questions to fire at you as soon as you've finished.
Thank you very much, Philip, and it's great to be here, and it's great to see so many of you that have come through the heat to hear about this topic. And I should say that in this role, I'm very much speaking in my personal capacity as the Heywood Fellow, not on behalf of the British government. And one of the things that the Heywood Fellowship does is to try and encourage us to think long term, so think over sort of 15 to 20 years about long-term issues and strategies for the UK. So if we can put up the first slide. What I'm going to talk about today, actually the next one, the one with the picture, yes. So I'm going to focus on the global economic order. So this is going to be a bit of an economics-y conversation, and apologies for those of you that are not deeply immersed in it. But this is intentional to try and understand that while there is a broader security order and the context that we're operating in, part of my thesis coming into the Heywood Fellowship was that we hadn't done enough deep thinking about how globalisation and the economic system was changing and what that means about the UK's approach. The picture is there to show that we're trying to think about the interrelated elements of globalization, so trade and finance and energy and technology, and not just dive straight into one of those areas. And the reason for that is that there is a government ministry responsible for each of those individual areas, but actually some of the trends and structural shifts are operating across many domains. I'm trying to help think about that kind of cross structure. So what I was going to do today is try to do three things fairly quickly. The first is to set out why I think the UK needs to change approach, why we need to refresh our approach to international economic policy. Secondly, I'm going to say a bit about what I think that new approach should be. So I'm going to present to you some of the thinking we've been doing in the fellowship of how to address the challenges the UK faces. And then thirdly, I was going to say a bit about what that means for our relationship with Europe and the EU, given this is the week of the 10-year anniversary of the Brexit referendum. This is a very topical question, and then very much open to questions. So to just start with the case for change, some things that you will have heard others say, but that I agree with, which is that the globalization, the period of globalization that we have lived through has come to an end, that there are fundamental forces disrupting the kind of economic system we've been in. Some of those are external, so in my picture we talk about the wider security and strategic context, the era of US-China strategic competition, the rising use of power in economic and political life, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fundamental shifts that that's driving in terms of conflict in Europe and the weaponization of economic levers. So that kind of security environment really fundamentally shaking the kind of global system we have. Also, though, through domestic politics, the fracturing of the consensus and trust in the UK and in other nations, questions about whether the economic model is delivering across all sections of society, and some of that informing the kind of approach the US is taking, at least under the Trump administration. So there are some external forces that are disrupting the kind of model we had. But I think it's also worth noting there are some discontinuities within the economic model. So one obvious one is the rise of China. As looked at as an economist, China is interesting in many ways, but from an economic point of view, it has a different economic model, the state-led model of capitalism, and it hasn't fundamentally changed that since it joined the WTO. And the trading system was not set up to sufficiently deal with that kind of different economy operating within it at scale. And that's the other important part, that China has reached the scale of trading and investment relationships that is now moving the dial globally, and yet it is presenting some fundamental challenges to the model. A second change, I think, that's happening within the order is the behaviour of the US as the economic hegemon. So we have lived through an era where the US has been, at least in the last couple of decades, much focused on sort of its role in upholding this economic order, bringing globalization to other partners. It's shifted now, as many have said, to a more transactional, a win-lose kind of framing rather than a win-win kind of framing, which makes a big difference. And it's definitely looking inwards more in terms of economic security and economic strength. And then lastly, I would say there are many other things, but the other one I would pick out is what's happening in technology. Again, from an economic lens, what's interesting about the AI revolution is not just that it is another frontier technology that could bring very substantial productivity and innovation benefits, it's that it is driving through a concentration of economic power. So the nature of the economic change that's happening is concentrating around intellectual property, around data, into large businesses that have some of the attributes of monopolies and that kind of behaviour, and that poses challenges to the system. So I think the era we're in is fundamentally shifting. The second point to make about why I think we need to change is we don't actually know where we're going, and this also makes life very challenging. So I do agree with those that say we're in some kind of interregnum or some kind of long transitional period to some new That means that we need to think about a range of different scenarios, and this makes developing strategy also quite complicated. So one of the things I did in January was publish some scenarios as part of the fellowship, and I talked about 4 different ones. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but essentially we've given them lovely G titles like everybody else does, but one that we call G0, which is really driven by the US retreating and staying away from its global economic leadership role, and what would that look like? More influence from China, but also a much more disordered system. A second where we played around with a contestation and weaponization of economic levers, so that we call this the G versus G, but this is really pushing through the idea that economic interaction fundamentally in the world moves away from being about win-win cooperation and much more about how can I impose cost on you and how can I defend against you imposing cost on me. A third scenario where we imagined the US and China finding some way to accommodate, negotiate. There would need to be some change in behaviour on both the Chinese and US side to get there. That feels like a more stable world, and when we present it to lots of people, they quite like that one because it feels easier to manage. It poses some interesting questions for the UK because the G2 does not have the UK in it, and so you're challenged around influence and shaping. And then the last one we played around with is we described as GX, but it's really playing with this kind of technology, concentration of economic power in technology firms, importantly in a global sense, concentrated in the US and China. And you get a very odd mix of economic policies if you imagine a world that's dominated by the way those interests think, because they're interested in markets but also not interested in markets at the same time. The point of giving you that background is to say none of those scenarios involve going back where we've been, and to reinforce, I think, why we therefore need a strategy. We, the UK, need to really test hard the big bets we've placed and the approaches that we've taken that need shifting, and where those scenarios disrupt those big bets, we need to have a strategic response to that. And just sort of muddling through is unlikely to get you there. So I am a big believer in the discipline of sort of strategy development. I also think you need a strategy, we need to train strategy because we need something that's robust to many futures. And I have lots of conversations about this work where people kind of really want to be in one of the scenarios and design all of the policies for that scenario. But actually a good strategy is one that is robust to a range of scenarios. And lastly, the practitioner in me thinks that I've had some debate with academics about does the UK even do strategy, discuss, and that is an interesting conversation. My view as a person who's been in government for quite a long time is you need some kind of guiding directional principles about what you're doing. It's too costly to relitigate every decision all the time. And I actually think we had a set of guiding principles on globalisation in the past. I described us as being an activist globaliser in my paper in January, and I set out what I thought the UK was doing. And I've had very little pushback on that as anyone saying that's not right, Jenny. So I think we have had these kind of guiding principles, even if we haven't written them in a document. So that's what I think we need to shape. So then to just move on to what do I think we need to do differently, and this is, so we need to move from this activist globaliser to something that I think is about building secure openness. And I think we need to hold on to kind of what kind of country is the UK in doing this. And my current way of describing us, which I'll say something about, is I think we're something like a trusted partner and a proven innovator. And I'll say a little bit about that. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is my summary of what I think we need to do, and then I'll say something about Europe. There is a lot in here, so I'm going to give you the kind of broad brushes of it, and very happy to discuss. So at the top, what are we trying to do? We're trying to drive sustainable prosperity and rising living standards, and in my papers I basically say that goal hasn't changed, it's the way that you go about it. Who are we? We're a trusted partner and a proven innovator. The trusted partner is a nod towards the fact that we are a mid-sized economy, something like a mid-sized power. That is a a brand that doesn't work for everybody, but I think it is a good description of the kind of country the UK is. One definition of a middle power is a sovereign state that is not a superpower or a dominant global hegemon, but still exerts significant influence and economic reach on the world stage. And I think that's a pretty good description of the UK. Trusted because if you are in that position of not being a hegemon, you need to work with others, and trust is a really important thing to have, maintain and build. Proven innovator is a nod to the kind of country we are, the kind of economy we have. We are a very strong science and innovation power on all of the innovation indexes. You've all heard the story about 4 top universities in the world. When you talk to business in the UK, that is part of their reason for investing and anchoring. And if you think about biotech sectors and things like that that spill out from our innovation base, we're also a services-based economy, a very open economy. Proven innovator, I think, also is a nod to that we have proven innovation in our international policy, and we have innovated around these kinds of challenges before. Most recently, I think good examples are what the UK did in leading work on international development over the early part of my career, really shaping norms, building coalitions, getting action on the ground. You can think about the kind of work the UK did in the early days of climate change, things like the Stern Review, but also shaping carbon trading, climate finance, building coalitions around that. So this is my sort of, we've done it before, we can do it again, version of it. And then what are we trying to do? This is where I am shifting us from being an activist globalizer into this secure openness thing. Building because it has to be built. I don't think it exists fully in the current system. Secure because we need to be secure to the kind of environment I've talked about. So that's obviously first and foremost defense form of security. And secure to shocks, pandemics, financial instability. The bit that I would add is we need to be secure to managing power relations, coercion, and economic pressure. And this is not something we seek, but we need a strategy to manage that. And then openness, because we are at the end of the day the UK, you all know the statistics, trade is 60% of UK GDP, we're not food or energy secure on our own, we have a huge financial centre in the City of London. It's interesting if you present this framework to others. I showed it to an American colleague who wryly smiled at me the other day and said we probably wouldn't put openness at the end if it was the US, not in quite the same way. So that's what we need to orient around. And then I'm just going to say really briefly, I think that means we need to invest in these 3 pillars. And I think we've been doing one of them a bit, one of them we've started, and one we're not really thinking about enough at all. So the 3 pillars are competitiveness, resilience, and agency. Competitiveness is the thing we have focused on. We have had a traditional strategy on this in the UK. I just think it needs to shift more. So this is the piece that's about producing enough goods and services, getting capital into the country and holding it so that it invests in deployable returns and that we're accessing innovation and skills. This is quite a sort of traditional British view. The bit that I think we need to build more on, we need to have a much stronger focus on relative advantage. So where are we going to be strong in the medium term? It's a much more competitive playing field out there, where is either technology or other partners presenting a competitive challenge. And I think we need to be much stronger on securing value to the UK. So this might mean needing to intervene more to ensure that intellectual property or the returns to investment or the valuable bits of the economic chain are incentivised and stay with the UK and help build UK strength, and not being quite so agnostic about those assets and strengths just finding wherever they find their place in the world. Resilience, I think we have started on as a country, and we have really done that as many others have through COVID. If you think about banking, financial stability, that part of our system's always thought about it. The bit I think we need to add, as I say, is to think much more about how we manage power relations and coercion. And in one of my scenarios, we have the UK being coerced economically. And here I think that means we need to think more about diversification, So who are we trading, investing with, and much more consciously about that. If you think the old diversification strategy was basically global spread, global links, this is much more about being mindful about who you're diversifying with. And we need something that I'm calling credible countervailing power. It's horrible jargon, but essentially we need to have as an insurance policy some way of being able to impose some form of asymmetric cost on others, either on our own or with partners, as part of a defensive strategy, which if you come from a sort of security mindset, seems very obvious. If you're in an economics mindset, that doesn't at all, actually, and it feels really counterintuitive. And then on agency, this is about just recognising the kind of country we are. We need to make sure we're paying attention to how we influence and shape the world. So we need to really be mindful about our positive attraction, our assets, what are the things that mean countries want to partner with us, whether that's our quantum technology, whether it's the strength of our universities, whether it's the way that we use rule of law. The other part of agency, though, is recognising that this global system, if it ever was, is no longer moving towards harmonised, common, everybody moving to the same kind of economic model and the same kind of approach. So we need the international system to manage difference. And this is drawing on some of the thinking that Danny Roderick has done at Harvard. And the trading system in particular is going to have to reform a bit to be able to manage that difference. And it's in the UK's interest to help that happen. And we need to jettison idealised notions of global markets being perfectly competitive. And we're going to have to think about that friction. So that's what I think we need to do. As I say, there's a huge amount in there, but this is the sort of, you're getting the early view of where the Heywood Fellowship is coming out on this. Last bit I wanted to just say something about, and then I will stop, was kind of what does that mean for our relationship with the EU and with Europe? So the first thing to say is you'll have noticed I didn't start my fellowship with the question, should we rejoin the EU? And I didn't on purpose, because I think we need to work this stuff out before we can work out how we have a relationship with the EU. The EU is obviously a special case for the UK, given its proximity, its importance as a market, and the fact that it offers forms of membership and relationship. So it is actually a question that we should grapple with. And I align myself with others who've made the point that it's a negotiation and a partnership over time. So one of the most important things the UK needs is a stable consensus on what it is we want from the EU that can be maintained through a number of years of negotiation and potentially changes in political leadership. And it's not clear to me that we're at that point yet, but my fellowship has got a 15-year time horizon, so let's try and think about it. So the way I would think about it is, how does deepening relationships with the EU help us achieve these goals? Broadly speaking, the economics profession would tell you it will help with competitiveness because of the market access, the trade and investment, the studies that are coming out at the moment about the economic costs of Brexit, repeat to some extent the studies that were done at the time, and there is an economic gain to be had from closer relations. What those studies don't do, though, is deal with the radical uncertainty of the different paths that those actors could take politically, the different forms of economic model. It's very hard for economic modelling to do that. So it's not a criticism of my profession, it's just the limitation of that kind of assessment. So there are some scenarios, and we think about one where the EU becomes very internally divided and unable to do very much, and where the economic dynamism is in other parts of the world, and then that competitiveness gain looks a bit smaller than perhaps the modelling would tell you, but broadly helps there. What I think is quite interesting is that the resilience case for partnering with the EU has gone up, I think, actually. Thinking about how you both pool, in resilience terms, pool resources, pool together with partners to, whether that's on different areas we'll talk about, but also potentially, if you could pull it off, collective action against coercion. Agency, it doesn't tremendously help with, and this is part of the trade-off. Agency is probably better delivered through our own actions. And then the other thing I would think about is, as I say, the kind of scenarios of the future, and I won't give you the long description, but the short version is, when we look at our scenarios and we look at relations with the EU, and we have tried to do this as a team, There's a couple of them where you feel like you really want to be closer to the EU. There's a couple where you feel like that's slightly less important. So I just leave that as a thought. Again, you're trying to navigate this uncertainty. 2 more bits and then I'll stop. So the other thing we need to think about is, what does the EU want? Often under-focused on in the discussion in the UK. Actually, a version of this. The EU's stated goal is open strategic autonomy, and it is some form of collection of mid-sized powers or bloc, doesn't quite know. I've talked to lots of European colleagues as I've done my fellowship, and you ask them, is Europe a mid-sized power, and you get a range of answers. But it's definitely striving to do something like this. Great, so we have some shared basis to think about a longer term journey together. It also cares about the European project, and it cares about the unity of Europe and accepting the rules and trade-offs of the club. And this is the bit that always comes back in the UK question. So you have to accept a loss of agency if you want to get more of the competitiveness in dealing with the EU. And then when it looks at the UK, I think it thinks we're interesting, but sort of just enough. There's quite a lot the EU could do in building its secure openness, to be honest, where the UK doesn't feature as the most important part of that question. And it does still see us as a potential source of country that could undermine the European project by cherry picking or behaving in ways that are seen as sort of not supportive of a successful Europe. So given all of that, what do I think we should do? I think we should, for the practical reasons that we could go through, I think a kind of deeper relationship immediately is not a particularly credible path in the near term. So I would be thinking about how we build a future relationship with the EU on this shared agenda. And I'll just give you 3 examples and then I'll stop. There are lots, but just to illustrate. So on trade, I think we should be trying to remove the frictions where we can in a pragmatic way, the way this government's been doing it on sort of energy trading, the Horizon associations. If we can have a settled consensus in the UK and remove those frictions, that's beneficial. Also on trade, though, we should be looking at the global agenda. And this is where it's really interesting, sort of the EU showing an interest in CPTPP, conversations about whether India might be interested in that in the medium term, this coming together of countries that are much more vested in the trading system, both to hold it together and to shape it in the future. This is fertile ground, I think. Secondly, on technology, which is quite a fraught topic, and this whole question of AI and sovereign AI and alternatives, just to give you my sort of economic and Heywood lens on this, clearly we've got a concentration of economic power and particularly parts of the AI stack at the moment. The key question, I think, is what is the economics of this industry, and is it viable to have alternatives? Is it an economies of scale question, in which case trying to create alternatives in Europe will be hard? I can think of one example where we've done that in other areas in Europe, and that's Airbus. So there are times where Europe has pulled together to do something at scale, but they're not common. So if it's an economies of scale question, we should be thinking much more about how we apply this technology, the diffusion of AI. People talk about the apps at the top of the AI stack. That's the bit that we in Europe have an interest in, and diffusing that across and partnering to do that. And I think we should have a focused look at what we think about the economics of this industry. And I know the Treasury and DCIT have just set up an economics institute to think about these questions. I think it's been sort of and until you can diagnose that, it's quite hard to work out whether a European alternative is credible or not. And then on resilience, there's quite a lot we can do together. The really obvious one is around defence and defence industrial collaboration. It's a difficult sector because it's the one that has the most nationalism and national protection in it. And yet we do see big shift happening in Europe. This is the strategic direction that Europe's going in, to build much more autonomy on defence. There are some really interesting ideas around procurement, pooling of procurement. There are clearly the ideas around pooling of finance, the negotiation we've been having about SAFE. that kind of strategic long-term agenda, and I would just mention that for those that say we never do this, there is the example of GCAP of the UK doing with Italy and Japan deep pooling on a very specific defence capability. So I don't rule it out. I think it's a difficult journey, but I think it's an agenda. And interestingly, you could think about the same kind of thing in the finance space, actually, on payment systems and on the euro. So I'm going to draw it to a close there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of how I think about the world, why I think we need a new approach, and how that might apply to how we work with Europe.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It's interesting that you mentioned Airbus there, because that is a great example of where Europe has got its act together and has actually fought back against the dominance from elsewhere. But since you mentioned that, I've been trying to think of another example, and I haven't been able to come up with one. Maybe you've got one, but that does look like a bit of a one-off achievement to me.
So the other one I've got, so that's on defence. The other one we've got, and we're doing the history of
Defence,
it,
civil aviation.
Is the civil aviation is the Urenco in nuclear.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a UK-Germany treaty-based partnership on alternative nuclear technology to the US and Soviet offers, and still exists and has survived through Britain. It was set up before we joined the EU, survived membership and exit.
Yeah. But it'd be good if we could think of a few more examples of that.
Anyone else got any others?
So what struck me listening to you is that what I'm kind of hearing is that there are three blocks going to emerge here. There might not be blocks in the traditional sense, but the US is going down a different route from the one that it has followed for the last 40 years. It's no longer a champion of open markets and free trade. It apparently no longer believes in capitalism. It apparently does now believe in the power of big government to deliver outcomes. Very different story from the US, most of us have been used to. On the other side of the world, we've got China, undeniably a critical part of our economic picture, but with, as you said, a very different model of the economy, and not obviously a model that doesn't work, shall we say. Many of us have spent much of our lives repeating the mantra that you can't build a big sophisticated economy on the back of a repressive political system. Well, bingo, here it is, and it seems to be working. And then we've got these middle powers, ill-defined in the middle, who, if I was to be unkind, look like the group that hankers for yesterday rather than tomorrow, and we'll have to be very careful that that isn't how they get themselves branded. But they will have a different model, trying to be open with each other while being closed to the two economic hegemons with their different models. Is that what we're really talking about here? And if it is, doesn't this come down to economic outcomes? There will be different models. In 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time, one or two of them will have been successful, and one or two of them will have been seen to be failing. And public demand will be that the models change to match the outperformance. And I do know, just final point, personal anecdote, talking to Chinese officials as long ago as when I was in government, privately, that was always their view, that they could take a long view because they fundamentally believed that we did not have the means to match their economic model, because we would never build political consensus around the difficult decisions that need to be made to deliver Chinese levels of economic growth. So they only had to sit still and wait for the natural order of events to mean that they were left at the top of the pile and we faded away through lack of economic growth.
Yeah. So I think you're right that there's probably those three kind of broad approaches. I think the middle power group are a very diverse group, and they have some things in common that they wish to pursue and some that they don't. And indeed, I was just at an event this morning being reminded quite rightly by Indian and Brazilian colleagues that their view of this is very different. So there is a section of the middle powers who are essentially the kind of those that were in the US-led order and alliance, of which the UK is one, Australia, Canada, others. There are then another group who are these rising powers who actually, many of them, do not even wish to be constrained by the concept of being a middle power and see their future being a leadership pole in some way. And then you have a sort of another interesting group, I think, who we describe as the sort of connectors. And this is the sort of UAEs or the Turkeys of this world that have sort of thrived on the ability to sort of work between. So the middle crowd are diverse and will not, I think, ever come together as one unified block that is a third kind of version. But what they do have in common is much greater interest in open trade and investment and pooling, because they are smaller and do not have the depth of domestic market that either the US or China has. And that gives us some basis for cooperation. I think you will see it first, and indeed you already are, in the trading system. So I think it's this group that will shape the future, holding together of the degree of openness that we want and even forging where we go. So I think it's really relevant that the day that the Trump tariffs were imposed, I remember writing down my worst case scenario, and the modelling showed this for the UK. The worst case scenario was everybody else retaliating. Actually, the first order effects were not good, but were manageable. The bigger question was if everybody else retaliated, and everybody else hasn't. And I think that shows you, other than the Chinese, who are taking a much more China to US strategy, it shows that there is a shared interest out there in upholding some of this system. So I think there'll be things we can cooperate on. Can we make it work? Much bigger question. I mean, I also remember the conversations about China. I started my career in the Treasury in 2001, and I was the China desk officer at the time. And I used to have to forecast the Chinese economy, and it was so small and so far away that it didn't matter in terms of the UK's economic forecast at the time. And even then, people were saying the Chinese economic model isn't going to work, and here we find ourselves. So I think the honest answer to that question is we don't know, but I think we do have to pursue a strategy for us that feels like it's got the maximum likelihood of success in this world. Last thing I would say is I don't think the middle powers are going to completely shut themselves off from US and China. I think what they're going to try and do is have a bit of both and work out how to hedge and sit in the middle rather than completely close.
Okay. Jenny, just one other point that I want to make, and then I'll open it up and ask for questions from the floor. When you were talking about the UK needing to develop a strategy and having guiding principles, this isn't my usual language, but I had a sort of slight feeling of, here's the Treasury Foreign Office elite talking here. The challenge that we always have with these kind of things is this pesky question of democracy. We get very good people in the centre of government thinking about these things and working out strategies, and then we get politicians who have to go and get themselves re-elected, and making long-term strategy that involves sometimes strategies always involve trade-offs, and the public actually doesn't like hearing about trade-offs. They like to hear you can have your cake and eat it, to quote a famous former Prime Minister. That's the message the public wants to hear. And we are, to some extent, at a strategic disadvantage in Europe in having to go through the process of persuading the people for whose benefit this strategy is being devised that they actually like it. And quite often they don't like it because they don't believe it's going to deliver the long-term benefits. That puts us at a strategic disadvantage to some of our competitors, not just China, but the very large number of non-democratic or only quasi-democratic societies that we deal with. How do we avoid democracy itself becoming a strategic disadvantage in the making of policy?
This is an excellent question, which I feel like you might be better placed to answer than me. I'll give you my thoughts on it. So one very practical thing and then a sort of bigger picture thing. One of the things I've done as part of the fellowship is a piece of deliberative work where I got a representative sample of the British people together to debate some of these questions. And for those of you that don't know deliberative techniques, it's where you give people information, you give them time to discuss something with people who do not share their view, and they then come to some kind of view about the answer. So it's not polling, it's not do you like this country or this country? It's grapple with the question. And we gave them themes around these issues, and we will publish the outcome of this in September. And what I would say is there is a degree of support out there for something like this kind of approach. Actually, what the British people were saying as we did this deliberation, it came through quite clearly, is a much stronger sense on focus on resilience, even if that costs a bit more to get there. A much stronger sense of how you invest in the success of the nation over the global. So they have, I would say, the globalizing elite view and the people's view has moved more to a sort of national endeavour, not completely nationalistic view, but a kind of look after your own at home kind of approach. And we presented them this with clear evidence of the costs associated with it. Rejoining the EU did not leap out as the most important thing to do straight away. And there was a lot of pragmatism about the UK as a kind of middle country and what we do about that and how we navigate. So I've tried to test a little, and I think there is something deeper underneath that maybe a better politician than me could then communicate to. On the bigger picture of the how we make democracy a strength, I mean, I think my only answer to this is that in the end, I think I do believe in the view that the brittleness of some of those other systems can also be a weakness for them. What we are going to need to do is build a strategy that can try and retain some degree of broad consensus over time and stick with it. And I come back to the fact that I think I can point to other areas where we've done that in British national life. So I think it is possible, but it does have to be grounded in a sort of deeper sense of who we are and where we're going, with the politics sort of laid over the top.
Food for thought. We'll look forward to seeing that when it's published. I'd be interested to see who's in this representative sample of the British people, because it must have been a big room, I reckon.
Yeah.
Gentleman there, if you want to ask a question, Jacqueline will come around and bring a microphone, so please wait till you've got the microphone. If you've got an affiliation, yes. Please state it. If not,
African News Agency. You mentioned Britain needs to change its economic approach. Was that partially because of Brexit? Also, I noticed that you haven't actually mentioned anything about the impact of the Iran war on Britain's economy and the global economy. Thank you.
Shall we do a couple and then,
Yeah, would you like to ask your question as well, and then Jenny can answer both of them?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum. I'm a former intelligence analyst in customs and excise, and indeed over 20 years ago it was increasingly obvious that a lot of what would be considered law enforcement and criminal investigation matters had a strategic geopolitical impact. My question is, though, as a staunch admirer of the Blavatnik Institute, how are your wider colleagues in the economist community reacting to what you're saying? Because I do believe many of them are somewhat uncomfortable with defence and security matters.
yeah.
Right, why don't you answer those two?
So, why do we have to change approach? Is it because of Brexit? It's because the world's changed, is my answer to that question. So it's more than just because the UK's left the EU. It's because the nature of the global context that we find ourselves in, the behaviour of the US, the rise of China, the weaponisation of economic levers, some of the strategies that were available to us 15, 20 years ago are not, and therefore I think we need to change, rather than it specifically being about that decision. And on the Iran war, I mean, I think that's probably partly because I'm looking over a longer time horizon, so I'm not doing the sort of day-to-day, how do we adjust to what's happened this week and this month. I'm taking the benefit of the Heywood Fellowship to trying to think about decades rather than weeks. But it absolutely comes into my point about contestation and conflict disrupting the economic system that we've got. So that would be my answer to that question. How are the economics community reacting to this? So, I mean, I haven't published all of my final views, so you'll have to ask me that question in later this year. I think I think some of the most interesting conversations are these conversations about what's your assumed counterfactual. And part of the conversation we have to get into with a deeper conversation around the economics is, if you assume certain things to be true, then the strategy we've been pursuing makes sense. If you assume other things are going to be true, it doesn't. And a lot of people have just got presumed counterfactuals in their mind that you either need to disrupt or challenge. So to try to bring that to life, I mean, I have a couple of examples. I think diversification is an insurance policy if you think there are going to be lots of shocks and lots of disruptions. If you think the world is going to be fairly settled and fairly benign, diversification is a cost because you're just adding in optionality when you don't need it. My diagnosis is that there's going to be quite a lot of shock and disruption in the world, and then diversification is a sensible insurance policy because it insures you against the bigger cost of not having that when things go wrong. This is how a sort of economics world would talk about it. So it's partly about disrupting the counterfactuals and at least testing what implicit assumptions people are holding to then get to the right answer or a more sophisticated answer. And it's partly about understanding what it is you're trying to do. The other example I use for people, which I try on my international colleagues, is if you thought the Americans were going to change tariffs every year, not just once, what would the collective response to that be, rather than if you thought it was a one-off change? And theory, and I think practice, would tell you might get more cooperation in the first scenario than in the second, when everybody thought they were doing more of a bilateral deal. So a lot of this is about what world you think you're going to be living in and what a sensible strategy looks like.
Isn't there a pendulum swing, though, between resilience and leanness? You know, when something's not available, suddenly the economic imperative is to get it more or less at any cost. And so we swing to resilience. But then the normal processes of the market economy force us back towards leanness, because competitors will reach for leaner solutions over time and will undercut those who are investing in resilience. So unless you can persuade the end consumer to pay for resilience, the pendulum's always going to swing back to leanness, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think these are probably, one thing we've talked about in the team is whether these are dials, and this is about things you're dialing up or dialing down over time. I think what I'm arguing is we need to dial up a bit of resilience at the moment.
I prefer pendulums because they move under they move under their own steam, not anyone else dialing them up or down.
And if you talk to at least some of the business community, and I think it depends what sector they're in and how they operate in this environment, they are beginning to move towards that resilience side anyway. But I think as a nation, that's what we need to do.
Right, gentleman here with the yellow tie.
Thank you very much. Can you comment? If you ask the British government what their economic model is, I find you tend to get a version which is much, much better than the actuality. Whereas if you ask the Chinese government to describe their economic model, you get a version which is much worse than the actuality. What do you think about that?
Nick will be next. Do you want to ask your question, Nick, and then we'll take the two together?
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to ground what you've said in something that I can have a bit of practical application. So Nick Horton, ex-CDS, now House of Lords. If in the future your model is adopted, how does it interact with the development of a costed SDSR? Given the one that we've got now, which was delivered a year ago and accepted, it now quite clearly is not affordable. The Defence Investment Plan, when it gets over the line, will not resolve the problem. It will define the challenge of what we are having to do without. The Defence Investment Plan, I would gamble, has some sort of non-discretionary elements, which are not just elements, they're huge. The nuclear programme, the AUKUS undertaking that adds to that nuclear programme, the commitment to GCAP, and dare I say the commitment to artificially intelligencing and making autonomous the future way we conduct war. It appears to me that the current system has left us with some very poor choices because there's not much room for discretionary choice in that bit of the budget that should go on the operating costs of having armed forces that have got the training, the manpower and the consumables to fight. So how do you see that your model impinges, liberates, improves the level of decision making in capability decisions?
Excellent questions. I don't know what to do about the economic model one. I think you're probably right in the difference between how countries describe what they're doing and what they're actually doing. And maybe part of what I'm trying to say in some of the historic work that we've been doing, we've been looking a bit at British economic statecraft history internationally. And some of that is to try and show that we've been less purist on some of this stuff than we sometimes say to ourselves. So we will say things like we are, an open free trading nation, which is true to an extent, but there are also other things we do that are not entirely consistent with that all of the time for good pragmatic reasons. So I think that sort of understanding of pragmatism rather than sort of thinking we're some perfect version of an economic model is helpful, and a reminder that pragmatism is useful is probably my best answer to that question. On the defence side, so I am not an expert in defence spending, or indeed I haven't been very close to the specific discussion, but I think this approach would do two things. One is it would be consistent with the view that we need to think about what's the UK's relative role in defence projection, and are we playing the right role within a wider system of what everybody else is doing, and not trying to do force projection everywhere at scale, which might be the older frame of a sort of great power sort of framing. I'm sort of firmly in the view that we have a role to play. It's a really important role to play, but it's alongside and with others, and so it probably changes what you are choosing to invest in with that in mind. The other bit, though, is that the way in which threat and risk can come at us in this world is not just through hard warfare, but through coercion, disruption, the use of economic levers. And what I am saying is we need to take that seriously now and prepare some defences to that. They could be not hugely expensive, especially compared to something like an aircraft carrier. They don't require a lot of capital expenditure, but they are in the credible countervailing power point. So working out where the UK has some levers it can exert internationally and use those to deter others from deploying power against us is something the UK's not done, and I think we should do, to give us some defence in the economic realm as well as defence in the traditional security realm. And that might not be hugely expensive, but is something that we should do as a country. And indeed, one of the things I think we're likely to say when we get to the end of the fellowship is that you could run a sort of resilience ruler across a whole spending review and do it with that kind of view in mind, and that isn't quite how we've done traditionally, so not just the defence budget but the wider set of UK public spending, and we have some thoughts about how you might do that broadens the focus of how you're getting that kind of resilience and defence.
But if your model produces faster economic growth, that partly answers Nick's question, because there are trade-offs. You'll still have to have the row about whether the product of that growth should go to social spending or defence spending, but it's a much easier row to have, ask the polls, if your economy is growing at 6% a year than if it's growing at 1% a year.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? There's a gentleman at the back there.
Thanks. Charles Enoch, formerly at St Anthony's, Oxford, and formerly at the IMF. Two parts of the question. One word you hardly use, is climate change. Another one is epidemics. You've got a very atomistic approach here.
Yeah.
And I'm just questioning, some of our biggest issues are global, and one still needs to talk to everybody else, and there's climate change, and otherwise a lot of this gets thrown off. And same with epidemics, so you need your WHO, you need all these. Again, it's questioning. Your atomistic work is extremely interesting and useful, but you need a superstructure or something where you're still going to be talking to everybody. And even on something like defence, does one really go atomistic, or does one try an Airbus model early on? And does that save something that we go in and talk to people and say, we'll do the wings and you do something else, rather than working things out and then reviewing it again. So it's really, it's sort of, to what extent do we still need wider cooperation? Isn't that part, an integral part of what you're studying? Thank you.
So another question here. Yeah. Gentleman with the glasses there.
Thank you, David Richmond, former Foreign Office. I just want to pick up a little bit about the point about trusted partner and proven innovator. You said we've done this in the past and gave some very good examples and said therefore we can do it in the future. But my feeling is that when we were a trusted partner and proven innovator, it was a time of confidence, when we had reasonable political stability and reasonably strong economic performance. In recent years, we've had neither. Is it really credible to believe we can be a trusted partner and a proven innovator in the current state of our politics and economy?
Yeah. Both great questions. So the question from the back is a very fair challenge. I think it doesn't come through enough because I've been spending a lot of time trying to start with what the UK wants and how we should see ourselves, because that feels like the bit that we haven't interrogated enough. It absolutely comes back out to then the fact that we need to work collectively on global challenges. My framing was to try and start with us and work out where we go, rather than start with the global and work down, partly just to disrupt that thinking. But I absolutely agree with you, and I didn't probably emphasise the climate piece enough at the front. And I would say some of the work we've been doing on sort of how countries shape what happens globally, this whole sort of middle power conversation that's happening. Climate change is one of the most interesting areas where those countries have been really important in shaping the outcomes. Even though we know it's the big guys that need to make the big decisions, actually what the diplomacy and the impact of those kind of powers has been really significant. So I think that's a really, really fair challenge. On trusted partner and proven innovator. So, I mean, I have the same thoughts as you. I think it would be easier to do that if we were growing really well and had lots of political stability. What I would say is, in the travels I've done this year and in the many conversations I've had with folk from other countries, which has been a lot around this, they still look to the UK. I've had many other countries say to me, what's the UK doing on this agenda? How are you leading? We would really welcome some thought leadership. So I think there's still space. I think it would make us stronger if we had that stability and that growth, but I think the world is challenging enough other countries are trying to work out how to navigate this, that even with a slightly less robust base to do it, there's still appetite for what the UK has to say.
It's a relative game, isn't it? If you look at the ranking orders of perceptions of countries, the US has fallen so far that there's a chance, even though we have our own difficulties, to still have a voice. Mm-hmm. That's not actually a very reassuring basis. Gentleman there will then be the last question. We are going to finish sharp at 2.
Can you hear me? Jim Earl, barrister. But there used to be an adage, there probably still is, that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And I wonder, when you're trying to sell your new framework in a democratic context, whether it might not be beneficial, for instance, to relabel the resilience column flexibility and adaptability, and to acknowledge that when other countries ask for our lead, and to say, well, things are going to change, and the important thing is to be flexible enough to be able to change with them.
Yeah, I mean, so all I'm going to say is I'm going to channel my previous Heywood fellow on this, Lucy, who did a lot of work on national strategy. I completely agree with you in the sense that you absolutely have to adapt to reality, but I do in my bones believe you have to have some idea of what it is you're trying to do to then adapt within that reality. If you don't have some kind of strategic direction and sense, it's extremely hard to adapt to that reality, because it's just chaotic and it's just bouncing around and it's receiving a lot of incoming without any sense of direction. So my hope would be not that this is absolutely absorbed in some way that then becomes a cast iron strategy. It absolutely needs a political ruler running across it. I can't quite do that as the Heywood Fellow, but I hope it gives some sort of strategic direction to what it is we're trying to do that you could then test strategy against.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much for a very interesting insight into the work you're doing. And you've got another how many?
until September.
Only until September,
Yeah.
and then you'll be publishing something at the end, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you all again. We do promise to finish these things at 2 o'clock sharp. We'll finish a minute early today in respect of the temperature extreme. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you at a future GSF event. Thank you.